Welcome you all to today's session, which will be about accessibility and diversity and why these two concepts are important, basically to help every learner in your English classroom thrive. So my name is Dr. Amina Douidi. I hold a PhD from the University of Southampton. I investigated in my doctoral research interculturality and opportunities to intercultural communication in Algerian English textbooks and their use in the classroom. I am originally from Algeria and currently based in the UK. And professionally, I work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion and intercultural communication consultant with publishers. Simply put, I help publishers review their materials from a diversity perspective, see who is represented, who is invisibilized, and make recommendations on how they can make their materials more inclusive and representative of the diverse and beautiful world our students navigate. So today my focus will be on accessibility and diversity. Take it as an introductory session of key concepts that are close to my heart, and you will have the opportunity, of course, to participate and ask questions in the chat. First of all, we will start by having a reflective activity together. We will be using Mentimeter. Then I will broadly speak about accessibility, what it means, and the key concepts that we need to be aware of. Then I'll talk about broadly diversity and how it would manifest in the language classroom and the school. We will summarize our discussion into identifying 5 key inclusive strategies that you can implement as soon as you're back to your workplace. And then I would be definitely asking you, what was your main takeaway? Samantha, I will ask you about your main takeaway as well, so be sure to focus with us. So first of all, let me invite you to join this Mentimeter activity. It is a reflective task. The question is, thinking back to the last academic year, has any of your students felt left out? So Samantha will help me in the chat. She will share with you the link to join the quiz. The question is, can you think of any of your students who has felt left out? Have you identified why they have left out? So just think about it. I'm going to share with you the Mentimeter right away, and we start looking at the results. Here we go. Oh, we start seeing responses already. So did any of your students report feeling left out? Have you maybe observed them feeling left out? And I can see that a lot of you are reporting that, yes, you've identified students that maybe have felt excluded from the environment, the learning environment where they are studying. I can see that the majority of you are responding yes. Some of you are saying, I don't know, which is fair, because in contexts where, for example, you have large classrooms, you might not have the capability or the capacity to work one-to-one with your students or to create space for an intimate conversation with them, or maybe you don't necessarily have dedicated time to cater to the needs of the students in the sense of in a personal sense. So thank you so much for responding. We're going to move to the next question, which is in few words, what do you think contributed to this feeling of experience? So for some of you who answered, who said that yes, they found out that some of their students were feeling left out, I'm going to ask you another question that I am presenting here. So the question is, in your opinion, what led them to feeling left out? And this is an open-ended question. Try to use fewer words. The first response that came up was puberty. I guess you are young learners teacher or middle school, secondary school teacher. So hormones can have a big impact on the educational experience of our students. So I'm going to read out some of the responses here. Definitely relate to the hormones response. Lack of representation could be a reason for students feeling left out. Lack of understanding, age, the pace of the teaching, maybe the pace of the whole teaching and learning experience, the pace of speaking. Sometimes students complain about their teachers being too quick or too fast in moving from one session, one lesson to another, or in their way of speaking as well. Lack of support from family, inability to use technology. Class was too difficult. Pacing has appeared again due to proficiency level, age, assumption of ability. This is an interesting one because we assume sometimes that our students would know how to deal with some of the materials we provide them. Not understanding what to do or how not to stop learning. Some students are definitely dedicated. Shyness, lower language level, not enough time to devote to them individually, not appropriate level, definitely something I have experienced myself with having students who are advanced speakers of English, for example, and other students who are in an intermediate level, and sometimes they feel left out because of how quick some other students are in the classroom. They come from different countries, prior knowledge, they might not have enough background or information about the subject you're teaching. Some are naturally introverted. These are really nice answers. Thank you so much for sharing with me your experience. The fact that they are new students who come from a school where they previously didn't have English classes and now placed in a class where most students are in advanced level of English. Anxiety and depression. Not all students open up to their teachers. So the fact that you could identify this as a reason, it means that you have enough access to them, to your students, which is to your honor. Education system, classroom environments, lack of understanding or speaking English, not being popular. Yes, the social hierarchy in schools can be cause for bullying. It can be cause for favoritism as well. It can be also cause for isolating certain students. And teachers know. Teachers are very observant. Personal issues, what happens in their family home, impacts what happens in the classroom. In my field of work, we always say you teach the whole student. So the students, when they enter your classroom, they don't leave at the door. They don't leave their identities, their experiences outside. They don't leave it at the door and then check in to follow your session, but rather they come into your classroom with their whole baggage, and sometimes this includes family issues. So I've identified, just from scanning through these answers, I've identified a couple of themes here. So we have neurodiversity that has been mentioned as well, and as well as background that was also mentioned. The level of English is a big theme as well, and hopefully we'll get the chance to talk about it. Not in detail in this session, but it is something to definitely be aware of. So thank you so much for playing along. All right, so now that we have a little bit of understanding of what the session is about, I know now a little bit more about you. Let me start by introducing the topic of accessibility. So having an accessible learning environment means that all learners and teachers, who we tend to forget, can access the material and immaterial space of learning. From the examples you've shared with with me, we talked about access to technology, for example, being able to access the language level or understand the level of the language. So that would be the material space of learning. It is something that is physical, it is something that we can identify and we can work with, and so on. However, the immaterial space of learning is these other dimensions that you can't really pinpoint, but are also isolating to a lot of students. They exclude a lot of students. And we talked about these immaterial spaces in the examples that we shared with me. One of them is the society, the school as being a social microcosm, a small society where there are hierarchies. Some students may have more access than others, etc., etc. So when you consider accessibility, first you take into consideration the teacher, but also the different physical and non-physical, metaphysical, conceptual understanding of space. So why do we need to craft better access in the first place, and for whom? The school, as we know it, has been created with neurotypical and non-disabled students in mind. It most certainly has been, historically speaking, school has been created to serve certain societal projects. So during, if we take the example of industrialization, the goal was to teach people how to become workers in industry, any types of industry, if we take the example of industrialization. So school was supposed to be the pipeline through which we reach the working force, and it was created in mind by having people that are supposed to be performing in this industrial world, in this workforce. Therefore, it was designed by and for neurotypical and able-bodied or non-disabled people, for a population that is neurotypical and non-disabled body of students. And that means that many things that are not taken into consideration when we design our lessons, when we build our schools, when we organize our classrooms, many things are not taken into consideration because they are considered exception, something that is extra, that we need to create for only certain numbers of students because the need arises. And these students can, we typically categorize them, or maybe the categorize is not the right word, but then the two concepts that would help us understand this population of students are neurodiversity and visible and invisible disability. Neurodiversity is a term that talks about the neurotypical and neurodivergent students. We all belong to a neurodiverse society that ranges from neurotypicals to neurodivergent people, and it means that there are neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals who make up our society, which accounts and they account, the neurodivergent students account for 5 to 10% diagnosed neurodivergent individuals, and here this is a broad estimation worldwide. In England, for example, it is estimated that between 15 to 20% of students are neurodivergent. So if we take the example of a classroom that has 10 students, then you may have 1 to 2, maybe 3 students who are neurodivergent, or in a larger classroom you might have about 15 to 20% of students who are neurodivergent. In terms of visible and invisible diversity, the concept of visible diversity is widely understood because we're talking about, access in terms of if students, if they are visually impaired. So we accommodate them in a sense that we are inviting them to sit at the front of the classroom to be able to follow. We may be making, our fonts bigger for students who are visually impaired, or maybe we make access to the rooms for students with wheelchairs using wheelchairs, then it will access to the school or access to the room more practical and more accessible. So that would be something like visible disability. However, the disabilities that we as teachers may not have information about or is not documented in our schools are invisible disability. So an invisible disability or a non-visible disability is an impairment or health condition that is not immediately obvious. It is estimated that 70 to 80% of disabilities are invisible, and that include having a lot of pain, for example, having hearing issues that maybe are not visible to the eye, but also sometimes they are not diagnosed or not communicated to the teacher, and so on and so forth. So when we think about accessibility, these two concepts are central: neurodiversity and disability. Today, we're going to focus on one aspect of neurodiversity. Again, I am not an expert in accessibility and neurodiversity, neither am I with disability. However, I would like to direct you towards resources that can give you at least some background information to help you understand or see what's going on with your student. Try to understand, okay, how can I help my students better? Your job is not to put a diagnosis. You are not necessarily a psychoanalyst or a neuro specialist. So, and that's not something I'm doing here. I'm not claiming to be one. However, there are signs that you need to be aware of, and at least be aware of some of the key terms that are important when it comes to neurodiversity. So some forms of neurodivergence are ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, autism, which is the spectrum of the autism disorder, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyslexia, and Tourette's syndrome. There are other types of neurodiversity depending which source you're going to check, but these are the few ones that I'd like you to be aware of. So in the next slide, I'm going to share with you a testimonial from a university student who speaks about her experience with dyslexia and how her teachers have been reacting to that. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and I would like to invite you to listen to this video with me.
How do you find your teachers at school with that? Yeah, I mean, they are really understanding and they're really helpful. I think teachers, when you kind of come in on the first day of school, of course, they're all made aware and they all know that you do struggle. But I think sometimes as the year progresses, they can sometimes forget. And I'm kind of the type of person that likes to be kind of where all my peers are, and I don't like to fall behind, or I don't like to make a fuss or complain or things like that when I don't understand. So I think that can lead teachers to sometimes forget. So if I do make a spelling mistake or I read something out loud and I kind of stumble, they kind of almost forget they forget that I do have dyslexia. So that can be kind of hard. Yeah, but generally they are supportive and they help me.
And when you do get sort of spelling corrected and things, how does that kind of make you feel?
Definitely. Well, I mean, it's definitely hard, especially when you've kind of written an essay or done a piece of homework that you've tried really hard on and put a lot of effort into, to then get it back, and the main kind of criticism is, oh, your spelling's wrong. That can definitely be really hard because it feels like, oh, they don't care about the other stuff. It's just the spelling that matters. So yeah, I definitely did find that hard. But yeah, I think I've kind of learned to embrace it and kind of accept it, and definitely making teachers aware is helpful.
And how do you find your teachers?
Very powerful testimonial that we have here about a student. But if you notice at the end of the video, she says that she learned to accept it. To accept the fact that her teachers may forget that she has dyslexia, and she learned to live with it, basically. And it brings us, it has to bring us to the thought that the students are now accommodating the teachers, and it should be the other way around. So because the system is not designed to include students with dyslexia, then dyslexic students end up creating these creative strategies sometimes to accommodate the rest of us, the neurotypical classroom, the teachers, so that they do some extra effort in order for them to succeed in school, basically. So some of the strategies that schools have been using, especially here in the UK, in accommodating dyslexic students, is giving them 10 to 20 minutes, sometimes extra time during exams. And it has been reported that these 20 extra times and 20 minutes extra at the end of the exam does help some of the students to maybe perform at ease with less anxiety and less stress. However, it doesn't necessarily solve the inequality that they experience in sitting for exams, when the exam itself, the way it was worded, the way it was organized and structured, the questions that were asked, and the kind of information that are expected from the student to produce or reproduce, don't necessarily take into consideration the dyslexic mind or the neurodivergent mind, which brings us to the thought, this reflection about how can we make sure as teachers that our teaching materials are inclusive to dyslexic students. And I'm saying dyslexic students because this is the example I am sharing here, but the question extends to other not neurodivergent students. And how can we make sure that our exams don't penalize our students for their dyslexia? So she cited the example of spelling mistakes. So a lot of students, especially when they are learning a foreign language, sometimes they haven't been diagnosed with dyslexia when they were learning and studying their first language, but then the signs start to appear when they are started to learn and use the foreign language or the additional language, and that's creates another layer of difficulty to them. It's a new language and they are struggling in processing the words and the text, etc. So the question is then, how can we include them in our classrooms? And one of the questions that she asks is about spelling. One of the issues she raises about spelling. So maybe one strategy you could apply is, in order for you could create rubrics in your assessment and maybe give 10% a grade for a 10% slice, or I forgot my words. So give, for example, only 10% focus in your 100% essay to spellings, and the rest could be divided into structure, maybe ideas, creativity, and other criteria that can help the dyslexic mind thrive, basically. So if you're creating an assessment rubric, and then you would say, okay, I'm going to judge the text based on 5 criteria. 1% is spelling, and it shouldn't be the most important one. Why am I picking on this example in particular? Because I've been to classes at university, for instance, where teachers dismiss completely the creative idea behind the text when they see that the spelling is not appropriate, or when they read the first paragraph and they find a lot of mistakes, then they will dismiss the rest of the essay. So having these frameworks, basically, where you have, okay, 10% for spelling, 20% for creativity, 20% for structure, and so on and so forth, it would basically give a chance to everyone in your classroom. Yes, diversity. So let's talk about diversity and how these terms, accessibility and diversity, kind of are different, but they complement each other. So the concept of diversity within the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of education and in the field of English language teaching in particular focuses on diversity mainly in terms of identity, and those identities are related to race and ethnicity, age and appearance, culture and religion. Neurodiversity and disability is one of the criteria that we take into consideration when we are assessing the diversity of materials or of a learning environment. And also socioeconomic status, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and or sexual identity, and all of these concepts as well fall under the umbrella of gender identity. And all these inform and impact the learning experience of your students, as we could see it in the Mentimeter quiz. Some of you have mentioned, for example, that some students have issues with their families, and sometimes the background, the socioeconomic status of the family impacts what happens, the experience of the students in the classroom. So I'm going to share with you an example of, let me just pause here. I'm going to share with you an example of how gender bias in the classroom manifests by sharing an interview of an English teacher based in France, and she teaches middle and secondary school teachers. So in this interview, she's basically she has kindly accepted to share with me a reflection about her own teaching. And I'm going to just stop talking and share it with you now. Please, Sam, let me know whether you can hear the sound or not.
I was saying that they were more quiet than boys, and boys were more they were more searching for attention and moving a lot, and they needed to be in the center of attention, and they were seeking for it. So I had to give them what they needed in order to have peace in the classroom and not be disturbed by their talks and movings. But this impacted therefore the equality in the classroom between girls and boys, because I didn't give as much as I did with boys the chance for girls to interact in the classroom, as I was more seeking for calm, and I was rushed by the time. I was looking at the clock and was like, oh my God, only have like 15 minutes left, so we need to rush and you need to focus. So I was giving more task to the boys than to the girls, because I was rushed by the time and seeking to finish on time my lesson. I was saying that there were.
So thank you for Sarah for sharing her testimony. She goes on and talks about how she worked with her colleague, and she had the chance to observe her colleague's classroom and sit at the back of the classroom and observed how her colleague performed in the classroom. And she noticed that the same thing was happening in her colleague's classroom. Her friend was also given more speaking time to the boys than to the girls. Please note that here boys and girls are used as a binary gender representation to just to highlight that it is very difficult for a lot of teachers to be able to move away from these binary representations. So sometimes you may have in your classroom students who don't identify, identify, for example, as non-binary. So note aside, please consider this in your own teaching. Maybe you will have a chance to observe one of your colleagues, sit at the back of the classroom and see their performance, or how they treat different spaces in the classroom maybe differently. And that actually helped her become more aware of her own bias and think about strategies on how can she organize her session maybe differently the next time to be able to give speaking space. We talked earlier about the material and immaterial space. So the speaking space would be an immaterial one for everyone in the classroom. Of course, when you have larger classrooms, when you have maybe 30, 40 students, you cannot technically teach or allow 40 students to speak at every session. However, you can think about ways on how you will plan your lesson in a way where everyone will have a chance to contribute the way they want to contribute. So you would have students that are more creative, students that are more vocal, students that are more dynamic in the classroom. So if you sit at the and just think about how can you include everyone in their with their different abilities and different maybe ways of doing things, then you can design maybe station rotation kind of frame of teaching. You can do flipped classroom approach where the students do most of the reading at their own pace. And then when they come to the classroom, it is more for critical thinking and critical discussions and so on and so forth. So one advice I would like you to take away from Sarah's experience here is that she used peer observation as a way to identify her bias, but also lesson planning and strategy and to overcome the kind of limits that she found in her own teaching. And this is just an example of how gender bias can manifest in the classroom. The other biases that I would like to share with you is based on the materials we use, the books, the textbooks, and sometimes we are obliged to use the textbooks that we are handed by our schools, and we have very limited room for adaptation. And sometimes it is a question of time, just like Sarah has shared, she didn't have the time to give the space for everyone. So maybe now that you are sitting with us in this webinar, you will think of creating some time to reflect on ways you could adapt the materials and how the bias in these materials is articulated as well. So the example I'm sharing here is a worksheet from a global textbook that I have adapted. I need to emphasize this because I am not showing you the exact worksheet that is in the English textbook that I have analyzed, but I have recreated the spirit of it. So the theme was around volunteering in Africa, and there were pictures of children, Black children, smiling and happy, and there was a white person in the middle. You can see that they are in the picture on the right hand side, they are maybe working on a well somewhere, and in the second picture in the middle you can see that there's a white woman surrounded by Black children who is having teaching or reading for them using a book in her hand. So you can see that the people at the center of this video are not these children. However, they are, even in the text here, that the story is about Simon, who is 20 years old and goes from the UK to Nigeria to volunteer. Again, the original worksheet wasn't about Nigeria at all. However, the idea is that it was about moving from the UK to somewhere in Africa and contributing, maybe building a well or building a school or doing some kind of volunteering work, but the story is about Simon. This worksheet is very problematic in my sense because it shows it reproduces this colonial vision of how volunteering works, and it also doesn't center the story from the perspective of the children, who are actually the most important individuals in this story. So one way that you could, as teachers, if you are faced with materials like this, which are problematic, is to ask the student, what do you think this text is problematic, or these stories are problematic or not? If you think that you don't have the space for them to reflect critically on the material that was provided to you, You could recreate it, reframe it. You could make it about somebody from Nigeria, maybe go into the UK and volunteer in a charity there and flip it upside down, and don't make it about, you know, the North saving the South, but rather some intercultural exchange on an equal basis, although equality would be a myth in this sense, especially that there are historical power imbalances at play here. I invite you to reflect on their inclusivity by looking at the different dimensions such as race and ethnicity, age and appearance, gender, culture, religion, socioeconomic status, and neurodiversity. Maybe I would like to share with you how, for example, some of our biases as teachers take place in the way we treat our students. I'm going to share with you first an example of a teacher I had the chance to talk with about some of her students, and she was saying that she has she teaches English class in the afternoon on Fridays, and she has one student who never attends this class, and she was feeling very sorry about him missing out on opportunity to learn. Every Friday he would miss out this class, and she was saying, well, because he says that he has to go for Friday prayer, which is a tradition and a practice in the Muslim communities and for people who embrace the Islam religion, the Muslim religion. So for her, the way I interpreted it is like he was missing out on school because he says that he has to go to prayer, Friday prayer. And it was optional for her, that he was choosing to miss out on school, and that he was not necessarily going to the prayer, but she accepts it and she believes it. So us teachers, we can be honest among each other. Sometimes we don't believe our students when they say they're doing something, and we think, especially teenagers, we think, is it really the case? Are they really going to practice some religious rule and some religious rites or religious responsibility or practice? And then we doubt them, right? There are many ways she could have approached this situation. She could have maybe talked to, I think she did, because teachers are really, really invested in their students' experience. Maybe she could have talked to the school and finding ways maybe to change the teaching hours for him, or offering him opportunity to attend another class in a different time. There are ways around it where we could accommodate the students because they will be missing out on a session. And that was kind of it wasn't a judgment, but it was I felt it as a bias towards the student who missed out on school because of religious practice. Another thing, it was about race and ethnicity. It was something that I personally have experienced, and I thought about it for a minute. I was invigilating an exam at university, and there was this big amphitheater, and it was packed with students, and they have very little space between themselves, and there was in a corner 2 students who were really, really close to each other. And as an invigilator who is observing the classroom, making sure that everyone has, is feeling comfortable, but at the same time, my job is also to check if anybody is cheating and reduce the opportunities to cheat. So there were these 2 students sitting really close to each other. And I thought, in the middle of the exam, shall I, and that's just a reflection that I went through in my head, shall I go and ask them to, move slightly, sit slightly apart from each other? Will I disturb their focus first? Who do I talk to first? Is it the student sitting on the right and the student sitting on the left? And the reason why I asked myself this question is because one of those students was a person of color that was not and the other person was white, and my brain goes, but if I go to the person who's sitting on the left hand side and I start with them because it's easier for me to access that student, then I would maybe I wouldn't be the first one who doubted them, who assumed that they might cheat, because of how, historically speaking, people of color, especially boys and men, how they have been prejudiced against in the global north, in Europe, for instance. So there is this societal assumption, and with the media coverage about how people of color, especially boys and men, are portrayed in the media, it creates a lot of bias. So I thought maybe I won't be the first person who targeted him, and maybe he will experience it as something against his identity rather than something general. Oh, I didn't think about his race. So the fact that I was very proud of myself that I didn't do anything about it, and I just sat there and I made sure that everyone was comfortable. However, it went through my mind and I thought, okay, if I approach him, would my approach be considered microaggression? To this student who has asked nothing, he was sitting in a place, in a seat that was given to him, and then he was the one easier to access for me. Then I just sat there and didn't do anything. But I just wanted to share this with you as a vulnerable way of saying that we all have biases.
I was saying.
All right, so this brings us to the question, which inclusive practice have you established in your own classroom? These are the ones that I am sharing with you today as a summary of what we discussed. The first one is establish a relationship of trust with your students. The second one is listen and research. There's plenty of information out there about neurodiversity and diversity in general, especially in the context of English language teaching. I'm sure you'll find what you need. Plan to include, so organize your sessions in a way that you have a space for everyone in your classroom. Make sure your PowerPoint, your materials, your instructions are very clear and clearly communicated to your students, so that they can follow your pace. Challenge your own biases, just as we just discussed, and prioritize radical joy. Bring happiness to your classroom as much as possible, because joy is radical. What will be the first action you will be taking away with you? And please just ignore my Mentimeter fail, basically. So I'm going into the chat and I'm going to be reading your comments. So prioritizing joy, I can hear you, I can read you. Reflect on the task, make students trust me. Paying attention to whether I am treating all students equally, being reflective, smile, prioritize joy. Make more contact with the students initially to establish their position with the language, definitely that. Being aware of how introvert maybe some of the students are. Peer observation is a takeaway that I particularly recommend. Prioritizing joy is a popular one. Being mindful, listening to our students, look at the materials I'll be using and replace any that are not appropriate. Establish trust. I really like prioritizing joy. It's a popular one. I will ask about their feelings and emotions. Definitely an important one. Ala Friedrich, thank you for being here. Prepare worksheets, exams, taking into account neurodiversity, example, dyslexia, empathy, equality, interacting properly, but also trusting when your students tell you how they're feeling or why they didn't do their homework, or just, having this trust relationship is very, very important. Listening to my students. make them feel comfortable. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with me your experience and your thoughts. Let me just go ahead and share with you how you can contact me. You can reach out via email, especially if you are interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can join my future newsletter, where I will be talking about my work and DEI. So thank you so much for your attention.